First off, thanks everyone for coming. My name is Wilbert Roget. I'm composer of Star Wars Outlaws, Helldivers 2, Mortal Kombat 1 and 11, and a couple of other things. And today we'll discuss our soundtrack to Star Wars Outlaws, focusing on the creative and technical solutions we developed to score this open world action adventure with dynamic music and modern production elements, while still carrying the orchestral signature of the franchise. So I've worked on Star Wars titles in one capacity or another for over 16 years, starting in 2008 as an in-house music editor and implementer at LucasArts. On Force Unleashed 1, I mostly edited music into cutscenes and coordinated the implementation, but we left it up mostly to the level designers to actually implement the music because I was inexperienced with our proprietary game and audio engines. On Force Unleashed 2, we switched to Wwise, finally, and I took a class on scripting, and I was much more knowledgeable in the game engine at that point. So I had a much more prominent role in implementation and music design. We had a very rudimentary interactive combat system that I actually designed on the fly during the orchestral recording session. Our composer was Mark Grisky, and he wrote in an authentic Star Wars style, but with a focus on these very powerful and catchy rhythms. So after we were satisfied with the recording takes of each combat cue, I directed some additional takes where I instructed the string section of the orchestra to repeat a single measure of whatever riff 3 times, and then have a kind of diminuendo throughout, and then end with a low sustaining note. This became the combat ramp down, which sort of let us gracefully transition back into the ambient cue of the level. I then beat mapped this in Wwise using the music system, and we set these ramp downs as the transition. I also wrote some brief percussive stingers myself to help transition from ambient into combat music. So here's a video demonstrating the Force Unleashed 2 interactive music system.
For the Empire!
It's a game that doesn't have a lot of stealth, but that still helped to kind of make sure that we have a little bit of variety, a little bit of relief to the ears so you're not just hearing constant combat music. My final project at LucasArts was Star Wars First Assault, which was a competitive multiplayer first-person shooter meant for Xbox Live and PlayStation Network. I composed a 70-minute score and developed a dynamic music system based on action points that decided both when to play music and what cues to play based on player actions and the situation. For example, like if you had a capture point or you got a bunch of kills, things like that, that would add to this action points counter. And once it reached a certain threshold, then it would decide to play music. There were no loops. Instead, the score was based around very carefully timed one-shots, and silence was the norm. We discovered early on that the difference between musical silence and a very subtle ambient cue was extremely dramatic. So we didn't really need to worry so much about low ambient music versus high combat music. It's instead just focused on that transition. And in addition to these through-composed one-shots, we also had a modular skirmish ambiances system. These were triggered by the aforementioned action point system once, again, that certain level of player involvement was detected. And it would iterate the counter that eventually results in music playing. So here's a brief example of one of our skirmish ambience cues. This cue was modeled after the vibe of a suspense cue in the prequel era Star Wars style, but it's actually assembled in real time by Wwise. First, a sustaining tone plays and it continues throughout. Then two randomized overlays play on top of it. And then that happens kind of in sequence over the next several seconds. And finally, it ends with a randomized ending swell. And because of this modular construction of these cues, we were able to get about 50 minutes of content combinations from just a 4-minute orchestral recording session for that cue. So it was a really, really useful technique. Lastly, my final Star Wars project before Outlaws was the narrative VR title, Vader Immortal. It used Wwise, but the music was extremely linear and scripted, with cues always progressing forward to the next scene. I wrote some pieces as loops for gameplay, but essentially the score was very linear in nature. I decided early on that the story was based around such an iconic character, Darth Vader, that we really need an authentic Star Wars prequel sound in order to underscore this story. Scoring Vader Immortal was a very fun experience, don't get me wrong, and it's possibly my most traditionally John Williams sounding project. But once I finished the score, I decided it was time to move on from writing in this style. And instead, I wanted to focus on the world instruments and guitars, electronics, and design sounds that would ultimately be the cornerstone of my later scores like Mortal Kombat and Pacific Drive. Similarly, I was frustrated at how rigid Star Wars music had always been so far in its implementation, at least for the scores that I'd worked on. We never had a fully layered or stemmed system, or vertical interactivity, as you might call it, due to the complexities in the orchestration of the John Williams style, which meant that the music had significant limits in how responsive it could be to gameplay. Well, a few years later and several game scores later, I was called on to score Star Wars Outlaws, which again is an action-adventure with an emphasis on gunplay and stealth mechanics. For the first time in a single-player Star Wars title, this game was fully open world with a non-linear second act and mission-based structure. So this was a very daunting challenge for a Star Wars score, but we had a few advantages working for us. First, early on, the Ubisoft team decided that it didn't want a strictly orchestral, traditional Star Wars sound, but instead it was open to instruments outside of the orchestra, including analog synths, Foley percussion, and soloists and world instruments. Second, the dev team had open world game music system design experience from the Division series. This was Ubisoft Massive in Malmö. And I had open world experience as well from my work on the unreleased original version of Dead Island 2. And third, we weren't required to use any music recordings directly from the films like we were on the Force Unleashed series. But instead, we could have an entirely newly composed soundtrack. And we could structure our music composition to the system that we would eventually design, adhering to certain compositional restrictions in order to finally allow for fully dynamic vertical scoring. However, the nature of the game posed a few new problems. The open world structure meant that we could make very few assumptions about the linearity of the music. Stealth was also a huge part of the gameplay, but even after combat has broken out, the player can still potentially return to stealth, like hiding into bushes or something, or running away. And hiding was an important part of the gameplay as well. Sometimes this could even happen in rapid succession. The intensity of both combat and stealth also needed to respond to the player's situation. Both the number and type of enemies needed to factor into the system. And lastly, the overarching goal was to build a score that emphasized the adventure aspect of the story. We needed sonic diversity and a close relationship to both the franchise and the needs of the gameplay. Star Wars Outlaws is, at its core, a heist story, where you play as a computer hacking, lock-picking, gunslinging thief. It isn't romantic Sith versus Jedi Star Wars or Empire versus Rebels story like the vast majority of all the previous games and films, yet it does take place in the same universe. So instead of saving the day or joining the Rebel Alliance or anything like that, the protagonist interacts with crime syndicates across several planets in the Outer Rim. And because of this, the dev team at Ubisoft Massive realized early on that it was fair game to use sounds and instrumentation that hadn't previously been explored in the Star Wars films. With this in mind, Ubisoft reached out to me for a demo, and because I was no longer interested in writing the traditionally orchestral Star Wars music, I intentionally focused on these non-orchestral elements. I created a main theme for the game's protagonist, Kay Vess, and put together this video for them to explain my creative decisions. So Star Wars Outlaws takes place in the original trilogy between episodes 5 and 6. But since this is the start of Kay's journey, episode 4, A New Hope, was my main inspiration for the orchestral component. It had a clearer orchestration and drier recordings than all of the other Star Wars scores, especially when compared with the prequels and the sequels. And I figured the Nashville Scoring Orchestra that we'd eventually hire could have a much easier time emulating this sound specifically. Harmonically, it sticks closer to predictable octatonic and diatonic modes, which would make transitions and crossfades much more seamless. And lastly, episode 4 had more of a melodic focus than the prequels as well, which seemed appropriate for Outlaws as we wanted to establish several character and faction themes. Early in the project, we identified unique instrumentation for each planet and faction. Each faction has its own signature sounds as well as melodic motifs, which helps differentiate them from each other and give unique flavors to the gameplay when fighting or sneaking through their respective compounds. As a happy accident, this also gave players little hints as to which faction's enemies might be nearby, which sometimes can foreshadow surprise encounters. Here's a quick video demonstrating some of the signature non-orchestral sounds we use to illustrate the criminal factions. Every planet had its own signature sounds and a very subtle melodic theme as well, which gave useful boundaries to each of the three main composers and promoted a wider sense of adventure as the player progresses through the game and goes from planet to planet. Additionally, the city themes also reflected the dominant faction of that respective planet. For example, Kanto Bite has a brief reference to the Zarek Besh theme. Mos Eisley states the Huts theme. Kijimi uses similar Japanese instrumentation to the Ashiga clan, and so on. So here's a video illustrating how we painted the planets with these signature sounds. In Outlaws, our guiding principle was that the classic John Williams Star Wars sound was an opportunity rather than a burden, and should be reserved for only the most epic moments with direct connections to the films. For instance, space combat or planetary takeoffs and landings, and of course the entire Imperial faction. But using diverse instrumentation for everything else, particularly in reference to the criminal factions and stealth gameplay, allowed more freedom in the implementation. We could more easily fall back on the non-orchestral elements when we created dynamic music changes. So before we dive into the interactive music implementation, I'd like to discuss our recording strategy for Outlaws. We worked with two different orchestras, the Royal Scottish National Orchestra in Glasgow and the Nashville Scoring Orchestra. Additionally, we hired soloist musicians to record several world instruments, including the ones I'd mentioned when discussing the factions and planets. The Royal Scottish National Orchestra was the first group we worked with in early 2023, and then again in early 2024 to wrap up the project. Their recording space is very large, as you can see, and we recorded the entire orchestra at once, or tutti. And as they're also British musicians, their playing style more closely resembled that of the players in the original Star Wars films. We used the RSNO for the more epic cues and ones that were closer to Star Wars tradition, again, like space combat, the Imperial suite, certain cutscenes and primary themes, and of course, the open world ambiances. The Nashville Scoring Orchestra was recorded at Oceanway Studios, which is much smaller than the Glasgow Hall and lends itself to tighter and more controlled mixes. We recorded in sections, first with the strings and then with brass and winds. Occasionally, we striped the recordings even further. So for instance, we might record passages of only low strings for more freedom in the music editing. This orchestra was used for the interactive suites and for pieces that needed a more modern and diverse instrumentation with synths and soloists in addition to the orchestra. So this means like faction themes, combat suites, and cities and character themes. So for this next section, I'll talk about the combat suites, which are the core of our dynamic music system. Because Outlaws is an open world game and features stealth mechanics, we needed a way to seamlessly underscore several levels of combat intensity as well as stealth and everything in between. Our interactive combat suites are based on whichever faction the player is currently facing, so there are separate suites for the Pikes, Crimson Dawn, Ashiga Clan, and so on. Before writing the interactive suites, we'd write a theme for each criminal faction in order to establish melody and instrumental palette. So for this demonstration, we're going to take a closer look at the Pike Syndicate music suite, starting with their faction theme. Once each faction theme was approved, we then start on the interactive combat suites, again with a complete set written for each individual faction. Each suite has 3 levels of combat intensity, low, medium, and high, and 3 levels of stealth, or what we called combat ready. And lastly, we have a layer in between called hiding, used for when enemies had recently engaged in combat but have lost sight of the player and are actively searching. We'd begin with medium level combat. We'd write that first, and it would use the full orchestra, strings, brass, and winds, plus whatever percussion, synthesizers, world instruments, or designed instruments that we wanted. it needed to have a Star Wars vibe. So the orchestration needed to be rather dynamic and varied, with subtle rhythmic or harmonic nods to the original film scores. However, because our game explores criminal factions in greater depth than the films, we were able to score from a slightly different angle. This is what allowed us to prominently use so many instruments and sounds that were outside of the standard symphonic orchestra. So here's a clip from the medium intensity Pike Syndicate combat cue. Once combat medium was finished and approved, we'd then write the high and low intensity variations. The high intensity was required to use the same exact brass and woodwind writing as the medium intensity, so that crossfades between the two would be seamless, and also to save recording time. The strings, however, could be completely rewritten for a more bombastic vibe, and all of the non-orchestral instruments as well could be replaced. So here's an example of that high intensity. And finally, we'd write the low intensity variation with a vibe that's closer to stealth. It'd be used in very sparse combat situations against just a few low tier enemies. It used the same strings as the medium intensity, but with no woodwinds or brass. The only exception being the Imperial Combat Suite, which had unique full orchestra arrangements for all three. This was all a very iterative process, and it was normal for us to go back to the medium intensity and adjust strings to work better on the low intensity or brass to work better on high and so on. But it was worth it for getting seamless and imperceptible crossfades in-game. Next was the hiding layer, which plays when enemies that were previously engaged in combat have lost track of the player's location and are actively searching. For this, we took a fully modern approach with no orchestra at all and focusing on synths and drums, or in the Imperial's case, we used piano and orchestral percussion and synths that were derived from sounds of the piano. So to get seamless crossfades to and from the combat states, we made sure that the hiding layer had the same length, chord progression, and timing as the combat cues. And lastly, we rendered hiding in two different layers with the drums separate from the main layer so that the drums could come in when enemies are closer by. So here's a demo within Wwise of how the low intensity combat leads back and forth into the hiding state. I wanted to give a quick note about this. This is not the shipping Wwise project. This is actually just something that we put together for music testing early on. I strongly encourage composers, even if you're not doing the implementation yourself, to have Wwise just to test and make sure that, I mean, obviously QA, but also just to make sure that emotionally things are working. You'll probably discover new ways of working with music that you wouldn't have thought of before. So here's this demo. Finally, we have the stealth layers, which again we called combat ready. These are quiet and suspenseful and intentionally very static, with just one basic vibe or orchestration throughout for easier transitioning. Like with combat, there are 3 intensity levels to combat ready based on enemy difficulty. The low intensity features meandering low strings and sometimes brass. Medium uses high-pitched suspenseful string pedals and synths. And then the highest intensity is actually mid-ranged and mostly synth-based. Each one of these layers has 3 parts: the aforementioned sustain layer, a constant layer of percussion, and some kind of an overlay. These overlays were individual chords or one-bar phrases that are randomized and complement the sustains to add musical interest. And while the percussion layer always triggers based on enemy proximity, the overlays differ based on the intensity level. For the medium intensity, they can trigger randomly every couple of seconds for just variety. But for the high intensity, they're reserved for when the protagonist notices or tags major enemies. And as you can probably tell, this was very greatly inspired by the system I developed on Star Wars First Assault, where we had that sort of ambient cue that was modularly constructed by Wwise. This is sort of a very similar pattern. So here's a video from Reaper showing all 3 layers of combat ready and how they're working together. And now here's another video from Wwise showing the transitioning between combat and combat ready and their 3 respective intensity levels. So in the end, our goal was for the interactive music system was to elevate the player's experience with music that still felt like Star Wars, but expanded greatly on the sonic palette and gave the impression of continuously evolving in order to underscore all of the player's actions and situations. So here's an in-game demo of the players sneaking up on Hutt Cartel-aligned bandits.
Go get him, buddy. Go to one.
What's going on?
Get me.
I got her!
What would I do without you, little guy?
And lastly, and just to show the more traditional side of things, here's a final demo of an Imperial base escape gone horribly wrong. So here's this.
I didn't join up with Garrison.
Who was that? What's that? What's that?
This area is off limits.
Something's off today.
See something?
What was that?
Watch out!
Let's get loud, Nick.
Get away!
Another waste of time.
Gotcha!
Raising the alarm! Have a shot!
Turn off that alarm!
We're pinned, Nick.
They won't quit!
We're pinned down. We are doing this the hard way. Fine, really.
Acknowledge TK-5621. Permission to use force. Neutralize the target.
Over here! Where are you? Find
We have reports of a dangerous criminal near your
Oh,
location.
good now.
Search the area and take her down.
Let's drive.
And that's basically it. So first, I'd like to thank Ubisoft Massive and Lucasfilm for having me on this incredible 3-year-long journey scoring Star Wars Outlaws. Huge thanks to all our co-composers and musicians and engineers and our implementers and editors and mix engineers as well, and all the musicians on the score. And of course, thank you to Audio Kinetic for inviting me to present here at Wise Tour. Thanks everyone for coming.
Wow. I've heard so much about you, but being here and witnessing all of this is really something special. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
I would invite anyone with questions. Now's your chance. Okay. Ready?
Thank you. Great work, incredible, and thanks for this deep dive. I'm very curious, when you work with soloists, especially world instrument soloists, very often texture is super important, as well as how they play it. So I'm just wondering, what is your process like with soloists, also in like from the mock-up stage going to final delivery?
Yeah, good question. So for this project, I think it was a little bit more Western in how we approached it. So we would have like notation and we would have mock-up and just, whatever sample library. And what they gave back was fairly one-to-one. I'm trying to remember if there were any counterexamples to that, but for the most part, it was pretty one-to-one. When I'm working on a Mortal Kombat title, usually what I'll do is I'll have my notation, but I'll try to have some point in the piece where they can improvise. And I think in every single instance when I was working with this one player in Greece on both Mortal Kombat scores, I would end up basically he would play the notated part for the melody, but then I would resample from his improvisations and replace almost every single note of the notated part, because they just play so much more naturally when you're playing in like an improvised way. And like, the Western classical scale sometimes doesn't really sound right on the instrument, so they're kind of struggling to get the notes right or whatever. But when you take their improvisation, then it's this much bold and more authentic sound. Unfortunately, I just can't remember exactly any examples of that on Outlaws, but I will say that one of the multi-instrumentalists we used, George Doring, he plays a lot of like guitars and string instruments. And sometimes he would just, I would give my list of sounds, instruments and notation and whatnot, and he would play that, but then he would be like, oh, by the way, here's this other, this guitar is kind of cool. Like, oh, check this out, So he would just come up with all of this other really cool stuff that then I'd, resample and edit and cut in. And there's some improvisation as well. The electric violinist, I had it because he's also been on all of my Mortal Kombat scores too. So on the Canto Bight Workers District cue, I had him just improvise over this little riff towards the beginning.
Great, thanks.
Any other questions? Back there.
Let's see my quarterbacking skills.
Yeet.
It's there. Okay, nice. Wow, that was endlessly interesting. So thanks.
Thank you.
I was just curious about the most of it was really clear, but the timing based, when a player comes or when a player is spotted, you have little flourishes or little motifs.
Yeah.
is there any were there any ways that complicated things like harmonically or rhythmically, like it didn't really sync up musically? Yeah, curious about that.
Great question, which I probably should have covered in here. So the reason that it works is because each one of these faction suites has its own respective spotted stinger or what do you call it? Melee stingers that use the same scale and the same harmonic basis and signature sounds of that faction. And what's nice, once again, is that because we were in this Star Wars Ep4 kind of sound, where John Williams was much more, okay, this piece is going to be diatonic, this piece is going to be octatonic or hexatonic, you could kind of get away with it. You could just make some, so we just had like a bank of swells that were all in the correct key and mode for that faction. And so it didn't really matter like where in the piece that they came in. They were also timed specifically. I think the spotted stingers are like 2 beats long, and some other ones like overlays are like 3 beats or 4 beats or whatever. And they're triggers in Wise, so they're on the beat. So it never really sounds too wild. Which once again, it was like such. I'm so happy that we made the decision to have this original trilogy type sound, because if it were a prequel type sound, you wouldn't really sync so much. In the prequels, John Williams had expanded his harmonic vocabulary so much more, and even his rhythmic vocabulary, and it would have sounded like you're just crossfading. Whereas here, it sounds like it could actually be a part of the composition.
Okay. So the stinger waits for the beat, like just a little bit.
It doesn't have to wait too long, but it does, yeah.
Thanks.
Hi. So first of all, thank you. As a long-time Star Wars fan, I really appreciate and enjoy how none of those scores are Star Wars, and yet it feels so much Star Wars, especially with modern tech. I really, really like that. But my question has nothing to do with that.
Perfect.
So it's about like all the intensities that you got for combat and also in stealth. Where does that come from originally? Is it a game design requirement that say, oh, we want some audio cues about how much enemies you got after you? Or was it like an audio department suggestion? Say, hey, we can make the music evolve to support it. Where does that come from originally?
Okay, so you mean instead of like just having one combat cue and one stealth cue, we have like the 3 intensities?
Yeah, exactly.
That was, it's weird. So we had this meeting in Malmö, Sweden, with me and the music designers, and it's just something that it was almost like the room assumed that we needed this.
Okay.
It's what I did on Dead Island. I'm sure that they did something similar on The Division. And we all knew that we wanted to make sure that because there's such a wide range of, you can like take out 1 or 2 stormtroopers, or you can go up against like an ATST or something, or like the entire base has just been alerted because I made some very questionable decisions about stealth. So we wanted to make sure that it felt like you were just being dynamically scored. One of my issues working on Force Unleashed 2 was that we had about 15 minutes of programmer time to code that system and 0 minutes of composition time. I literally like at the session said like, okay, we can have a system, but everyone please do this. So it was always kind of a pain and such a shame when like you're walking through a level, but like a mouse bot comes by, and technically a mouse bot is AI. So now the music is like suddenly jumped in intensity like crazy, and then it doesn't go away. So that always kind of bothered me. And so I was like, okay, we have to have some way that we can have these different intensities, and it just feels like you're naturally getting underscore from Star Wars.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure.
Time for one more question. Anybody wants?
Hi, thank you for the talk again. My question is more related to the general development process of this. So you greatly demonstrated how you made a very intricate music system with all these one-shots and stingers. And I was just curious, because it's so detailed, how did you manage of how much of the game was available to you to make this system this detailed?
Sorry, one more time,
How was the game available to you? Like, did you manage to, or were you able to play the game, test the game how much was the game available to make the system?
Yeah, I mean, we had a great relationship with the team over at Ubisoft, and so they flew us out a couple of times to check out the development of the game and how it was going. Our music designers also made some gameplay videos that just showed, I mean, because this type of stealth in this game, I think its closest analog is actually Splinter Cell, but you have that pet that you can command, and so the rhythm of the stealth is a little different, and so it did take a little while for us to understand that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Like playing the game physically in your hands was super important for just understanding how intense the intense combat should be and how stealthy the stealth combat should be.
So if everyone would just join me in thanking Will again for his presentation.